Hey guys, Bottle Guy here, and welcome to every episode of The Amazing World of Gumball Season 2 Reviewed. Now, this season has a total of 40 episodes. Season 2 I might as well consider as one of my, or actually it's more like my personal favorite season out of the entire series. Literally, hands down. You may argue me about other seasons, but you know what? I don't care. You may have your opinion, but this is my opinion. This season, my total favorite season. Now, we have 40 episodes, and it's going to take a long time to review. In my history of the seasons that I've seen, that I only forgotten like about a few episodes, but I still remember most of this season because it's that good. And in fact, I think some people might consider it as some of their personal favorites as well. And with that said, let's begin with the first episode of Season 2 on this long journey. Episode 37, The Remote. The Watersons fight over the TV remote. This is quite an interesting episode, to say that is, at the very least. Now, you see, the thing with this episode is that while, yes, it is funny and it's very good, the problem with this episode is that Anais is it's a bit terrifying. You see, she is obsessed with Daisy, and during the end it's quite creepy and unsettling. However, this is the first appearance of the Watersons' neighbor. But however, it is very odd about the way Anais has an addiction to Daisy, and that becomes a bit of a problem later on, but not that big. But however, this episode is still so funny and so good that I still have to consider it a good episode. Episode 38, The Colossus. Gumball and Darwin help Hector the Giant be less boring. So, fun fact, this is the first appearance of Hector's mother, and it's a little bit weird. But you know what? Whatever, who cares? My favorite part of the episode is the reasoning. You see, I just find it very cute and very nice about how Hector's mother just cares a lot about Hector and just wants him to become a better person, and because his anger can be a bit too much. The way Gumball and Darwin learn their lessons is just very cute and very nice. The ending's fantastic. And with that said, of course, this is a good episode. But however, I do have to say that some parts are a bit boring, a bit off, but who cares? Episode 39, The Knights. Gumball and Tobias duel for Penny's affections. Fun fact, Gumball can play the ukulele. My favorite part of it is the song. It's a very good song, and it's very classy and pretty good. I do have to say that it is pretty good. However, I do have to say that some of the segments that are used come out of nowhere, not to mention that Gumball kind of acts a little bit too mad at his family to make himself look good, but yet it still screws up because obviously it's the Watersons. But however, this episode is still pretty good. But it is pretty stupid that Tobias all of a sudden goes for affections for Penny, but you know what? It works, and for that I give it a good episode. Episode 40, The Fridge. Nicole pushes Gumball to becoming a success on the fridge chart, and I cannot speak. Oh my gosh! So this episode is quite surprising. There's not that many episodes that revolve around Nicole trying to motivate their kids. Not to mention, that's surprising that this episode is the first episode seen by 2 million people. That is something worth looking at. The ending is fantastic. It's beautiful about the way that the paintball gun fight goes well, and how funny it is. Not to mention that it's quite crazy about how somehow Gumball was able to make it home without dying. Although I do have to say that is quite surprising that Nicole would do something like that. But you know, it doesn't matter. It works, and therefore, it's a good episode. Episode 41, The Flower. Gumball gets jealous of Leslie. So, fun fact, apparently ghosts can possess other ghosts. It's a bit weird, but you know what? It doesn't matter, because this episode is pretty good. It does make sense for Gumball to get jealous of people against her girlfriend, because he really, really loves her. And when you fall in love with somebody like that, you do feel jealous at the person that somebody you truly care about is hanging out with. I felt that with my brother, and I love the twist of about the fact that apparently Leslie is Penny's cousin. I found that quite surprising twist. Not to mention that I really love the joke of how Gumball pulls Leslie's petals and keeps saying she loves me not inside his demonic voice. Not to mention about the fact that the humor is quite good as well. Therefore, I definitely have to give this a good episode. Episode 42, The Banana. Gumball thinks Banana Joe chewed Darwin's pen. Fun fact, you can exactly poke glue with pencils. Trust me, I dealt with that before. My favorite part is the ending because of how sweet and nice it is. This episode is hilarious. I cannot think of any other way to talk about how funny this is. This is probably Banana Joe's best episode, and the ending is quite nice and sweet. Not too much. It's quite funny about how the ending twists about how Gumball's usually chewed Darwin's pen and it wasn't his, and it was just him that chewed it. Not to mention that's quite lovely that they don't actually hit him in the end just because of that. And not to mention that's quite hilarious about how he gets surprised about how they all of a sudden be nice to him after they cause all this mess in the first place. And with that said, of course, this is a good episode. Episode 43, The Phone. Gumball and Darwin get their first phone. Fun fact, the ending parodies Yar's Revenge and Space Invaders. Now, before I talk about the twist, I do need to tell you about my problem. You see, the problem with this episode is that this episode is a bit hard to understand. Gumball has a phone, and he usually enjoys it a lot. But the problem is the fact that he all of a sudden gets annoyed by it and all of a sudden can't use it. But apparently Darwin is able to use it as well, which then leads to him being addicted to phone. While yes, I get that and understand that it's supposed to be a parody about how kids are getting addicted to phones and stop focusing on people, but with Darwin, it's just hard to see that in Science of Things. We've seen this problem as far back as The Kiss, but it's done way better. However, with all that said, the twist is kind of okay, and this episode is a good episode, but only by like a hair. Episode 44. The Job. Richard gets a job delivering pizza. Okay. So, you all know that I hate the Richard episodes in Season 1. I've said before that I didn't like how he treated Gumball and Doll unfairly because he made his wife believe in them, and thinking that the children are abusing him when yet it's him that's abusing them. It's not child abuse that much, but it's still annoying. I also said that I'm not really much of a fan of the prank about how he scares away his children, which I'm surprised does not give him traumatization. And so therefore, you all know what the episode's gonna be. It's a good episode! Yeah, I bet you all did not see that coming. This episode is fantastic. The fun fact is, I was right. And the highlight is, I was right. I don't know why I put that, but I don't care. This episode is fantastic. Richard actually does something right and gets a job. It's quite fantastic and interesting of him to actually get a job. It's just quite fantastic and beautiful and just quite fantastic for him to see. I know I said fantastic so many times, but this episode is just great. Not to mention that it makes sense. Not to mention that this episode explains why he doesn't have a job. And it's and not to mention that the humor is quite hilarious on here. Therefore, it's a pretty damn good episode. Episode 45, Halloween. Carrie takes the Watson kids to a real haunted house party on Halloween. Fun fact, this episode is 70% completely original, mostly because 30% of it is used inside Cast with Friendly Ghosts. My favorite part is everything, and if you can tell from the bottom, it's a good episode. I dress as a pumpkin just because of this on my head, despite the fact I don't have a body. This episode is fantastic. We see a little bit more of a hint that Darwin and Carrie are in a relationship. Gumball is enjoying himself and having fun. Nicole gets a bit of a reason to be here, and Anais gets a nice little joke about her being stuck in a well. Not to mention, it's quite interesting to see them as actual ghosts. We usually see the Watersons usually get possessed by Carrie, but instead they actually become ghosts and actually hang out. Not to mention that the suspense is quite epic and fantastic. Therefore, I do have to say it is a good episode. Episode 46, The Treasure. The Watersons siblings discover why they can't afford any knockoff groceries. Fun fact, this is the second time we see a backstory of something, that of which in this case, you will find out later. Anyways, this episode is quite beautiful. My favorite part of it is everything. It explains about a lot of fantastic lore and backstory about why some of these things happen. Not to mention that the humor is quite well, especially with the fact that they say that when Gumball was a baby, he was an ugly baby. Not to mention that's also funny about how Darwin is embarrassed by a dumb photo that he makes the same face of after he sees it. It's just hilarious and it's quite interesting, and And although it's kind of stupid about how the star all of a sudden disappears when they all of a sudden discover and learn about it, it's still quite nice to look at, and therefore it's a good episode. Episode 46, The Apology. Miss Simeon owes Gumball and Darwin an apology. Fun fact, I was right again, because this episode is a lot more different than the episodes where Miss Simeon filmed inside the previous seasons. She gets what she deserves, and all the things that she tries to do to make it look like that Gumball and Darwin did do something bad is hilarious. It's quite fantastic. And my favorite part of it is the money scene because of just how funny and stupid it is. Not to mention that I was laughing my butt off when I saw Miss Simeon come out the window just for the dollar when Gumball and Darwin barely even did that. It's just quite hilarious and stupid. But the best part about this episode, aside from the money scene, is how in the ending, Miss Simeon learns about the bad thing that she did, and not to mention that she actually apologizes, and they accept her apology. The ending, she does get comeuppance, but although I do find it satisfying, especially for what happens inside the previous seasons with her. Therefore, I think it's a good episode. Episode 47, The Words. Darwin learns to be salty. Fun fact, this song on No More than Mr. Nice Guy reminds me of Disney Villain's song. If you know that, then you understand. My favorite part of it is the battle, because of how it reminds me so much of Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and all those classic fighting games. It brings a lot of nostalgia. This episode is quite fantastic. I also love about the fact that Miss Simeon gets made fun of with her lady mustache, and apparently she has a lady mustache. Not to mention that the things that she says to some of the other people is quite fantastic. It is a little boring about how they do it, but about some of the parts in the beginning when Gumball tries to help Darwin, becomes salty, but it still works, and it still works with the plot. Not to mention that's quite lovely in the ending about how Darwin learns his lesson, and Gumball had to take some drastic measures and say some bad things in order to make it work, and then he feels sorry about it and apologizes about it. It's quite fantastic, it's quite beautiful, and it's quite a good episode. Episode 48/49. Somehow. The Skull. Gumball and Darwin learn that Clayton is a liar. Fun fact, most international versions of this episode is cutted the entire color shock scene. Of which I have no idea why that happened, but whatever. My favorite part of this episode is when Clayton becomes a horse. It reminds me so much of Gumby and Pokey when Pokey was a horse inside the show. Of course, he still was like that. However, it's still a good episode. It's quite interesting and quite conceptual about Clayton's growth development, about his lies and his truths. Episode 50. Finally, The Bet. Bobbert becomes Gumball's servant for the day. Fun fact, apparently Bobbert is slow. I don't know why that happened, but whatever. My favorite part of this episode is Miss Simeon. I don't know why, but it's just funny about how she cuddles him and all of a sudden gets on fire and doesn't mind because of how warm it is. It's just quite good. But, with that said, I hated Bobbert inside the episode The Robot from Season 1, if you guys remember. It was quite, out of nowhere, how he all of a sudden turns emotionally evil and then tries to replace Gumball, who then gets tortured badly, because it just feels a little stupid, not to mention, and that despite the fact that the show has a lot of stupidity, it still feels, it was beyond the show's stupidity, about everybody thinking that the robot is Gumball despite how bad it looks. And it's just so, and it was just so badly done. But you know what? This episode is funny. I cannot believe it myself, but it's actually funny. The jokes are so good, and the plot is done in a comedic way that it works. Therefore, it's a good episode. Episode 51, Christmas. It's up to the Watersons to save Santa and Christmas. Fun fact, Santa has only one reindeer, despite the fact that he usually has 8 reindeer. My favorite part of this episode is everything, which is why it's a good episode. It's just so fantastic about how it's dealt with, and just quite funny about how it's done. Not to mention that it quite teaches a lesson on what to believe in and what to not believe in. Not to mention that it kind of reminds me a little bit of The Grinch, and it's just done so well, and just so greatly, that it's just a good episode. Episode 52, The Watch. It's up to the Watersons to achieve an old family watch. Fun fact, Louie looks like an old version of Mickey Mouse, and Marvin looks like a jelly bean. My favorite part of this episode is a CPR joke, because it's just quite funny about how they can't give CPR to an old man despite the fact that they caused that problem. But with that said, I do have to say, oh man, strap in, folks. I got a little bit to say here. First of all, it was quite stupid of them to just go ahead and just all of a sudden give away an important family watch and then to all of a sudden have it later. It's just stupid. It's just full on retarded. But however, I do have to say, it is quite shocking about how they almost killed the old man, and yet it was all just for a stupid watch. Which in this case is also awful, but however, that does not give away from this being a bad episode. Because there is some jokes here that work, and some of them are quite funny, especially the CPR joke. So with all that said, I do have to say that I'm gonna give this episode a meh. Episode 53, The Bumpkin. Gumball invites Idaho to his house. Fun fact, Idaho lives in the desert. My favorite part is the opening. That's it. The opening is that's my favorite part of this episode. This, you know what? I think I know how to express this. This episode is awful! It's so bad! It's just so disgusting and so mean-spirited about how Gumball all of a sudden treats his family like crap, but yeah, he enjoys it, but yeah, he just doesn't go back at it. Yeah, like a total butthole. It's just so selfish and so aggravating that he almost kills somebody just for his own needs. He's evil in this episode, which I can't understand. This episode is the most closest thing to being as bad as the episodes from the first season. I just can't understand why this is a thing. I just literally cannot understand why this is a thing. Which is why I'm considering this episode as a Gumball episode. It's just so pathetic of how it's done and dealt with. That's just so sad and embarrassing. I hope, for goodness sake, that something like this never happens again. But something tells me that things will be worse later down the line. Episode 54, The Flakers. When Darwin bails Gumball, chaos happens. Fun fact, Marvin is apparently able to do reflexes, which I didn't understand. My favorite part is the Whistle Bros because of how hilarious this is. Which in this case, this episode is quite hilariously, fantastically hilarious. It's just so funny and how charming about how a relationship is broken because of some trust, and then it gets fixed later on which then leads to a humongous conflict that gets fixed later on. Therefore, I say that this episode is a good episode. Episode 55, The Authority. After Richard's accident, Granny JoJo turns the kids into Richards. Fun fact, satellites don't break that easily, so you don't have to worry about satellites being breaking that bad. And my favorite part of this episode is Nicole. I love how she tries to become a responsible mother, and she tries to redeem herself. And it kind of makes sense, but not that much inside this season. It would have made sense in later seasons, but it still works here. Now, apart from a couple of things, I did hate the laziest, and not to mention that it just brought on some bad flashbacks, but this episode is, believe it or not, you obviously know by this point, it's quite fantastic. I cannot explain why, but it's just fantastic. It just explains more backstory about why Richard is this way. Not to mention that there's a reason about why Nicole is there. Because unlike Granny JoJo, Nicole doesn't force them to do something stupid, which will lead to them having accidents and also stupidity. But yeah, and Granny JoJo did that and was acting more like an antagonist. And yet it works, and it's beautiful about how it works in the end about Granny JoJo all of a sudden realizes her mistake, and then finally acknowledges that Nicole is a good mother. And with that said, of course, it's a good episode. Episode 56, The Virus. An evil virus gets vengeance on Gumball, Darwin, and Terry. Fun fact, this episode was released 7 years before 2020. Yes, as I was recording while I was making this episode was made 7 years ago, but I was a bit too late on that, so my apologies. But this episode is quite good. It's quite beautiful. It's fantastic and hilarious about how this virus tries to take him down, but it fails so horribly that it's just done like a Looney Tunes cartoon. It reminds me so much of Wile E. Coyote and Yosemite Sam. And with that said, it's good and funny enough to become a good episode. Episode 57, The Pony. Gumball and Darwin race to get to NIE's to watch it with her. I forgot to put that inside the title, but never mind. Fun fact, Nightmare on Elm Street is a reference on Nightmare on Elm Street. If you're a little kid, don't try watching it. It's rated R for a reason. My favorite part is Rob and the hidden lore, which will be used later on down the season. It's great to see this happen because it then explains later on inside future episodes, but I won't spoil them for now. But this episode is lovely. It's quite lovely, actually. It's quite beautiful to see at the very most. This episode is just quite nice and also quite funny and done so well. Oh, oh, oh. To be honest, it's just quite beautiful about how Richard tries to give some good advice to Gumball and Doran switching legs, to Sussy's birthday party, which is probably quite funny. But the only problem is just Mr. Small. He's obnoxious. Like, really obnoxious. He's just in there for no reason except to extend in time. I would have had better time watching the Sussy birthday party or the legs, but you know what? It doesn't take away from this episode being a good episode. Episode 58. The hero. Darwin tries to prove to Gumball and their dad that he's still a hero. Some fun fact, some of the pictures aren't canon. Because apparently Because apparently Darwin tries to prove that actually nope, not that. I kinda screwed up. Anyways, because Gumball gets Darwin around Christmas, despite the fact that it's explained later on from inside the Origin special about Darwin from later on in the series, that he got Darwin from a man in a van. It was from Richard. And it was still the same thing here, but still. And also as well as some other things that I can't remember, like his outfit, which is not the same as later down the line. But it's not that big of a deal. But with this episode, man. Strap yourselves in, guys. I got quite an interesting story to tell. So, I do love the song of My Little One. It's quite beautiful and quite heart-wrenching about how it's done and how it's done to her. Not to mention that some of the humor done with some of the gags are done quite well. But the problem with this episode is that Gumball and Darwin become total jerks. Sure, Darwin and soon later on and feels bad and then all of a sudden makes up for it. But yeah, Gumball is just still a jerk about it and it's just still sad. Not to mention that when he's trying to save them, it's just still sad. It's just quite embarrassing and stupid to look at. And not to mention that it's quite retarded about how they talk about him out loud, and not to mention that despite the fact that the jokes do work, it still feels wrong for Anais and Nicole just not feed them. Like, I'm just surprised that that's not. I just can't even describe about how this episode is. However, there is something that is great about this episode. This episode is not that bad. I actually think it's not that bad because the humor is still there, but the story doesn't work. If there was a little bit more story than humor, I would have accepted a little bit more. But instead, I'm gonna give it a meh. Episode 59, The Dream. Gumball holds a grudge against Darwin because of a dream. Fun fact: Darwin has a sensor bar, despite the fact that he's not really have, But it's funny, which is why this episode works. There's so many gags jammed up, packed into this episode that just works. From the ending, and I feel like I should talk about the ending for a bit, because the ending is so funny. What basically happens is that when Darwin kisses Penny for the second time and the pineapple explodes, Gumball thinks of Darwin kissing Sussy. And it's hilarious about how it's done. Like, it's literally funny. I can't even speak anything because one, my throat's a little dry, and two, because of how funny it is to remember that episode. Oh, this episode is probably one of the most memorable episodes of the season, therefore it makes it a good episode. Episode 60, The Sidekick. Darwin holds a grudge against Gumball because of how he is treated like a sidekick. Fun fact, there's a background loop sequence, and it's quite classic of the usual cartoons. My favorite part is Darwin getting dark, because it's just surprising about how all of a sudden he gets, he kidnaps Tobias' mom because of the video game. And it works. It makes sense about why Darwin feels this way about being treated like a sidekick. Everybody has presumed this way. Every single cartoon character that has two male characters or female characters or both, one of them would feel like the sidekick and feel like it's just used for nothing but except for random reasons. Like Smurf and the Smurfs from back in the 80s and back in the day. But this episode is also funny for how it's done and dealt with. Not to mention that's quite nice and touching about how Gumball and Darwin apologize to each other and just make it up. Not to mention that's quite funny about how they try to chase after the wheelchair because they apologize. Nice. And with that said, it is of course a good episode. Episode 61, The Photo. Gumball tries to take a good picture. Fun fact, Banana Joe had a pose ever since breakfast. My favorite part is Gumball trying to fight Alan. It's quite hilarious and quite funny. Although, it's just quite funny about how Gumball somehow turns a cheek of Alan's, and then he all of a sudden feels a little disgusted by it. It's just so damn funny. I just want to let it out. Not to mention that this episode is funny, like legit funny. There's so many gags jam packed into this episode that I can't even describe it. It especially funny about Banana Joe's ways of trying to get to Gumball, to make him pay for a bad photo. It's quite good and quite fantastic. And not to mention that the plot works so well that, of course, it's a good episode. Episode 62, The Tag. Richard and Mr. Robinson get placed on the house arrest. Yes. Fun fact, do not watch the ending, and I'll tell you later on. My favorite part about this episode is the beginning. Like, legit. It's quite funny. Like, when you think about it and all the antics is done, it's like a Looney Tunes cartoon, but except funnier in the modern era. And the part about the do not watch the ending is because it's a little bit stupid and how they get back into fighting despite the fact that it's never mentioned again later on in the series. But who cares? It's a slight bit of continuity that I wouldn't mind for a funny episode like this. That makes it a good episode. Episode 63. The Storm. After trying to help Carmen get things spicy and things go wrong, chaos ensues. Fun fact, in the original version, Gumball says Bimbo, but now it's replaced with Howard, which is quite stupid and quite embarrassing. But you know what? It's not that big of a deal. My favorite part of the episode is Darwin copying Penny. I think it's just quite hilarious about how it's done and done to just distract Carmen and Gumball, to make it look like that they're kissing. Not to mention that's just quite hilarious about how it's done a second time, so because Penny comes back. But oh boy! But with that said, this episode has a lot of problems. So the problem with this episode is that Gumball is all of a sudden being treated it horribly again. We've seen this in season 1, and it worked terribly on there. Yeah, therefore it just doesn't work that well. Not to mention that Penny all of a sudden being mad at Gumball because of that when he's trying to avoid it is chaos, and yet it's just so bad, and yet everybody just starts yelling and screaming. It's just for stupid reasons. It's just a stupid ending. But however, the Darwin copy and Penny scene is so funny and funny enough that I can consider this a meh episode. Episode 64, The Lesson. Gumball and Darwin try to escape detention with a friend. Fun fact, this episode is quite similar to Chicken Run, which is quite interesting to think about. My favorite part about this episode is the third act. In fact, this movie is like a classic cartoon escaping prison kind of a thing, except its detention is treated like a prison, which is quite funny and hilarious, especially some of the butler parts. The final act is just funny because of how the bomb's head gets tiny and how Darwin puts a shell inside his leg somehow, and he makes him look like he's got a fat leg or probably something up with him. I mean, that's quite funny about how they still survive and somehow laugh at when they in pain falling off of school trying to escape detention. And it's just funny enough to become a classic good episode. Episode 65. The Game. The Wattersons have to finish the game of Dodge or Dare. Oh man. This is a throwback. If you guys remember from back in the day, in season 1, it was mentioned a couple of times, not to mention, but how we didn't get an actual episode of it until now. And it ends the childhood memory of Dodge or Dare. Not to mention that's just quite funny about how it's a parody of Jumanji from inside this episode, not later down the line. It's quite random about how it's dusted with that Darwin is somehow not the first fish, and yet Gumball eats him, despite the fact it's not inside the previous seasons. But yet it still works, and it's done totally well. It's just beautiful about how it's done, and it's just quite funny and fantastic. That, of course, I do have to admit that Anais is funny because of the way that she's supposed to dodge it there, and gets any questions about it. But also about the fact that this is, of course, a good episode. Episode 66, The Limit. The Wattersons try to get candy behind Nicole's back. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Man, this episode is quite a good, yes, I spoiled it, but still interesting episode to talk about. It is a little bit weird and kind of stupid about how they try to get the candy, not to mention that the candy song is quite stupid, but still quite interesting about how the fact is that Nicole is a scary, super scary psychopath inside this episode. Not to mention that my favorite part of this episode is that Gumball is told to be, that said that he was raised well, and yet he does other bad things, but yet he doesn't steal. It's just quite hilarious and quite funny. However, the candy song is quite stupid to look at, but yet it's still a good episode. Episode 67. The Voice. Somebody is threatening Gumball and Darwin. This episode has an eyeball with wings that has been seen in previous seasons, but yet I forgot to mention before, but now he gets a big role inside this episode, which gets used a lot inside this season, about the fact that he is quite similar to Harry Potter. Not to mention that's quite funny about how Tobias explains his problems, and yet Gumball and Darwin actually apologize, and yet it's done in a funny way. And also brings in some interesting reasoning for what would happen later on in the season about how Tobias is also one of the only people that notice that Gumball and Darwin get all the cool adventures and crazy shenanigans, like as if they're the main stars of the universe. And yet the humor still works so well. And the episode just works quite vividly. That, of course, I do have to say that's a good episode. Episode 68, The Promise. Darwin delays a promise to make Banana Joe feel better. Oh my god, I said that so wrong. Anyways, fun fact, The Legend of Zelda is a parody of The Legend of Zelda. Which, in case you didn't notice by that. And my favorite part of this episode is the gym. It's just so funny and so fantastic about how it's dealt with. Not to mention that the human here is quite fantastic and funny about how there's a joke about why Banana Joe doesn't have feet and a bunch of other things. And also as well, as Ocho and Gumball are fighting about how calm they are, despite the fact that they keep fighting. Not to mention that Ocho makes a big hole inside Gumball's butt. It's quite fantastic. Not to mention that the ending is quite sweet about how, even though they care about Banana Joe, they also care about their friendship and just want to spend some bonding time with each other. It's something that most fans can relate to. Therefore, why can't... Of course I can't say it's a good episode. Wait, of course I can. Darn it. Episode 69, The Castle. Elmore takes over the Watterson's house. Oh man, this episode is a classic. It's just so funny about how Nicole seems to be a lot like Medusa in the ending, of which in this case is quite hilarious and quite done so well. This is quite interesting, not to mention that that shot of Gumball and Darwin waving their waves at a fireworks background might also be one of the most iconic scenes inside the series.